As Judge Sharon said,
I'm reclaiming my name.
all right, Jeff, you ready to get started with the? Oh, you're already recording. All right, good evening, everybody.
Again.
Hey. All right. Good evening, everybody, from the New Orleans chapter of the Democratic Socialists of America. This is our event, Insurgent Campaigning with
Oh, are we recording?
the bench. We are. Is that okay?
I missed that part. Okay, good to know.
All right. So first, thanks for our team, for putting this together. That is Jeff on tech, Ty on graphics, Kate and Noah with logistics. I am your host, Aaron Zagary, and we are talking to the Flip the Bench slate, candidates who ran for judge in this November's election on a platform of ending mass incarceration, ending money bail, and fixing our racist justice system. And as someone who works at Tulane and Broad, I've long believed that if more people knew what indignities occurred there on a daily basis, they simply would not stand for it. So with that in mind, I want to thank our panelists, not only for joining us tonight, but also for running courageous campaigns to challenge the day-to-day inhumanity that happens in that building, and also for Tenee over at juvenile court as well. So to introduce our 5 panelists tonight, I'll start with introductions and then we're going to move on to some introductory questions. Those questions will talk about first the personal aspects of why these folks ran for judge at this time. Then we'll move on to more of the political context. So political machines interacting with the various endorsers and funders in the city. Then we move to more campaign strategy, messaging, and mobilizing, how these folks crafted their messaging, where they focused their time, what worked, what didn't work. And then we'll look ahead at perhaps some lessons to be learned about campaigning and New Orleans politics in general. Interspersed with that, we will have questions from the audience. This is a familiar feature that I'm personally unfamiliar with, but there seems to be a Q&A option at the bottom. So if you are able to click there and type in your questions, please include both your question and if there's a specific panelist you'd like to address your question. And then it looks like I will see it here in the box, and I will try to get to it as it flows within our conversation. So with that, I'd like to first introduce Nandi Campbell. She is the Section G judge-elect. Initially started with the Public Defender's Office here before launching NFC Law, which is one of the most high-profile defense firms in the region, practicing in both federal and numerous state courts. And in whatever additional time she has, holds dual teaching positions at Loyola Law and Tulane Law. Thank you, Nandi, for joining us. Next, we have Graham, whose video is not currently enabled, but I assure you he is here with us. He started at—
Hey, everybody.
Hey, he started at the DA's office before starting his own defense firm. Add to that a stellar resume of civic leadership, chairing the state bar's criminal justice committee, serving on its incarceration committee, and as president of the Mid-City Neighborhood Organization, as well as being active in the New Orleans Coalition, among a number of other groups. So thank you, Graham, for joining us. Next, we've got Derwyn Bunton. He is the first Black chief office that takes on 85% of cases in our criminal courts for people who cannot afford to pay for their own attorney. That office has won national acclaim and awards for transitioning the public defender system here from a pre-storm patronage system to a true public good of full-time attorneys to serve the city's poor and working class. And from what I've heard, they are pretty good at it. Felix, by reputation, is a legal dynamo of juvenile court, where, from what I hear, no judge, no prosecutor, no one over there has a better handle of the law than she does. She is a staff attorney at the Louisiana Center for Children's Rights, that is the juvenile public defender in this city, and was the 2017 recipient of the State Bar's Children's Law Award. All of our candidates ran for criminal district court, so adult court judgeships. and Tenee ran for the juvenile court judgeship. Finally, we have Angel Harris. Angel Harris is our Section L judge-elect. She started as a public defender in Orleans and Calcasieu parishes before moving to posts at the ACLU, NAACP Legal Defense and Education Fund, and the Justice Collaborative to work on capital defense, juvenile life without parole, policing issues, and school desegregation. So thank you, Angel, for joining us. Thank you also, but unable to attend tonight, were Meg Garvey, who challenged Paul Sens in municipal court, and I certainly would have loved to hear about that. And Steve Singer, who ran for magistrate court to end money bail, but tonight has to support his son in pursuit of a state soccer championship. So unfortunately, we will not be able to hear from them. So our conversation tonight will track our theme, insurgent campaigning, running progressive campaigns against an entrenched system where, although New Orleans is a Democratic city, some of our elected Democrats are rather conservative, especially when it comes to criminal justice issues. Our starting point for the night then is going around to each of our panelists, how you decided, or in some cases begrudgingly agreed at the last minute, to campaign at all. So with this, I'd like to start with Tenee. Tenee, in your juvenile court race, every candidate for both of those judgeships seemed to be saying that kids need more services. They need more support and second chances. We kind of heard this refrain that all of a sudden everybody was a reformer. So why in that context was your candidacy still necessary? So necessary.
So first, I believe that the candidates, so to be clear, I didn't hop into this race until the 11th hour. And I didn't know what I was doing. I was an absolute 100% reluctant candidate. My phone started ringing on July 22nd when Nikki Roberts hopped into the race. And there was a bunch of talk about, you know, whether or not this seat was going to get handed to the top juvenile prosecutor who has made it her business to incarcerate and transfer as many children as she possibly could during her tenure. And we were worried that maybe that was going to happen. And, you know, we didn't know, right? There were many people who tried to reach out to the incumbent judge to figure out, you know, if there was something going on. We weren't getting responses. On Friday, the last day of qualifying, at 3:30, after having taken several calls from so many people, not just people in my office, people outside of my office, people who I don't even know. I even got a call from someone high up in the district attorney's office who was pushing me to run for this race and offered to pay the qualifying fee. I realized that no one else was hopping in the race and that it really could turn out to be a situation where someone who hates children was going to be the arbiter of their fates. And I realized at that moment, I didn't know what I was gonna do. I didn't know how to run for a judgeship. It was never my goal to ever be a judge because I love doing what I do every single day. But I knew that I had to do it. And so I hopped in the race. I recognized that a lot of, I hopped in the race saying what I believe and saying what I've been doing for the last 13 years. It's about treating kids like kids. That is how we are going to create a safer community. That is how we are going to help the children in New Orleans who are coming through the juvenile justice system. You know, I've personally seen how just sticking kids into these cookie cutter programs don't work, right? And so I think that I was able to speak passionately from what I know has been happening. Juvenile court, it wasn't just that I was popping in there occasionally. I was there every single day for the last 12 plus years. And so I knew that the answer couldn't be court programs. I was so encouraged that even though I didn't make the runoff, by the end of it, everybody was saying treat kids like kids, right? I mean, that became a refrain that everyone began using. And I think that, you know, I think that the momentum of my campaign has made people view the juvenile court system differently and also view our children differently. And so I'm really happy that I even, got into the race for that reason, if nothing else.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that analysis of how you change the conversation. So thank you so much for doing that. I know as our conversation tonight goes along, I'll look forward to, and the audience will look forward to hearing about how somebody from the 11th hour draft then got such a robust campaign together and what lessons we can glean from that. But before we come back to you, let's circle around toward the opposite end of the spectrum, Nandi. So from conversations as well as even in the press, it seemed like you had been planning this run for years. So how did that analysis come to be? How did you decide that 2020 was the year that you were going to transition from your private practice?
All of the judges were up in 2020, so I decided I was going to run in 2020. The decision to run for G happened as soon as Byron Williams was stepped down from the bench and his investigation started. I knew I was going to run for G, regardless if it was an open seat or if I was going to be running against Byron Williams. I immediately, when I made the decision to run for judge, it came from just frustration with the bench, the inability to gather people to challenge incumbents. It's interesting when you don't get a challenger, judges would say, "Thank you, New Orleans, for re-electing me." And I used to be so frustrated by that because that's not really accurate. It's basically no one challenged you, and so you keep your job. New Orleans didn't have a say in that. So I had decided that I was going to run. I remember the first time I went into a felony section, a judge asked me where I was from, and I said I was from New York. And they basically said, "Oh, you could practice here, but you shouldn't. You'll never be able to run for office here." And I remember asking why, and they said, "Simply, you did not go to high school here." And so I think it's kind of ironic that my opponent platform, like half of his platform was, "She is not from here." So unlike Tenee, I spent 2 years kind of thinking about running, how I would run, plotting it out, and I guess we'll talk about that later, but participating in some things in the city as an avenue to network with people. I did a few fellowships in anticipation of running. When I decided where I was going to buy my house, that factored, not highly, but it made a difference. I wanted to be around the people I served. It was really important for me. And so for me, the run was planned, but the platform and the way it came out was not planned. And so I'm sort of kind of, at the end, as I start to debrief and think about the run, I'm thankful that I was able to run with people who had my same beliefs and had the same goals for the court as a whole. And like Tenee said, by the end of the election, I was really shocked at how, if you go back and you look at the first forums and you look at the opponents talking about their platform, and then go and look at the last forum and you see our opponents talking about a platform, except for mine. My opponent was just crazy. But everybody else's opponent, they went from basically, I want to do drug court, I want a safe city, to, I am going, I'm a reformer, and so it's so interesting. But it was also disappointing because I didn't want the message to be watered down by the fact that you had everybody saying the same thing. And so when we talk about messaging, I think that it's really important for us going forward to talk about how we can make some changes to make it uniquely progressive in a way that if you adopt it, you have to adopt it in a way that you have to do it with some substance.
All right, thank you for that. I've got a lot of notes from your answer that I'm very much want to come back to later on. So we'll talk about geography, both literally spatially being from here, not being from here, what that means for your political abilities here, as well as the geography that you talked about of neighborhood, of not just where you are physically, but who you're around. So that human geography and what that means for not just campaigning, but philosophically who you are and who it is, whose interests you represent. And we'll also come back to that theme of reform. Although we may, so our focus tonight is on campaign strategy, really coming back to that phrase, nuts and bolts. For further reading, I recommend anybody turn to our DSA voter guide from this last election cycle for background on Nandi Campbell's race, as well as her opponent. That we got a lot of good feedback on that one. But also this whole idea of reform and people turning to things like drug courts as that's reform, that's bringing medicine into criminal law, that necessarily must be good. And if you do the further reading, all of a sudden looks a lot murkier about exactly what we want to throw into the criminal justice system to solve these social problems. Themes that we'll get to later tonight. I'll try to stick to introductions. Next up, we're going to hit Derwyn. So Derwyn, I'll place you in the same camp of that 11th hour draft, but yours was a little distinct from Tenee's, I believe, in that it wasn't a surprise that Rhonda Good Douglas was running for that seat. She seemed to vacating Judge Kiva Landrum to basically inherit that seat. And so you jumping into that race, why pick that one, and what did that mean for you going in about what this race was going to be like?
Thanks, Aaron, and thank you for all the hard work you did during the campaign, and to DSA for paying attention and being vigilant on these issues throughout the campaign. And I suspect if the organization has half their members are as good as Aaron, they're going to stay engaged in these debates. But yeah, I was an 11th hour jump in as well. If you had asked me, 31 minutes before qualifying, am I running for judge? I would have told you no. And then 30 minutes before qualifying, I'm headed to the courthouse to qualify to run for judge. And there were a few things weighing on my mind and on my decision when I jumped in. First, there had been people asking me if I was going to run for judge for a number of years in different camps, and the answer was always no. And it had remained no up until about 30 minutes before qualifying. And what I paid attention to was Rhonda Good Douglas was initially running for Section K. Then Kiva left to run for DA, and she shifted over to Section E. And so Section E has a unique history because Section E is where the first Black judge was elected in New Orleans. That was Judge Calvin Johnson. And so it had some symbolic meaning, that particular section. And then I looked at her statements, and when she was qualifying, and particularly that last day, because she had a number of supporters lined up, and the idea was clearly to scare folks out of challenging her. She had lined up some support even before qualifying had ended, and what rubbed me quite honestly the wrong way was she referenced the sort of racial and gender reckoning that was happening in the United States post George Floyd. And her answer to that was essentially, I'm going to treat everyone in my court nice. And I'm like, that's just not a good enough answer in that moment. And then there was a rush of old, as chief public defender, what we do is we do a lot of exit interviews for folks leaving. It was a rush of old exit interviews where the number one question, why are you leaving? One and two, and they alternate, is burnout and how we're treated by judges in that court. And how are we going to change that? And part of that was kind of what we did was get some folks who were going to sort of change the paradigm. But I thought, as I saw everyone jumping into the race and having this courage, there is something I can do too. I can run as well. I can try to make a safe space for advocates and my colleagues when they come to court, so they'll have a place where clients are treated with humanity and they themselves are treated with respect. So 30 minutes before qualifying ended, I went over there and I qualified to run for judge. Now, I was also different in my campaigning in that I've been around a long time. I'm not from here, but I've been in New Orleans. I was born and raised in California. I moved to New Orleans in 1998, so I did not go to high school here, didn't go to college here, didn't go to law school here. But I've been here 22 years, wife, 2 kids, dog, house. So I was a little bit different. It was hard to call me out of towner, but in New Orleans, if you wasn't born here, you ain't from here. You're not a native. And if you didn't go to high school here, folks are like, you ain't from here. So that came out during the campaign. But what was honestly really overwhelming was our ability to get folks who were supportive of the run. And that was sort of grassroots. And it was a validation of the work that I had been engaged in for the last 22 years. And so it made the run a lot different. And like what has been said before, I think everybody realized the moment. And if you wanted to be credible in this election, what our running did, it meant that you had to grab the reformer mantle. Because if you didn't, you were in trouble. All of a sudden, you were in trouble. You couldn't just rely on a bunch of institutional endorsements and support. You couldn't just say, I'm from here. You had to say, I support Black Lives Matter. You had to say, poor people should be held in jail because they're poor. You had to say everything we'd been articulating. Folks had to say that. And that changed the nature of things. And it was really, I told folks when I jumped in, I feel like we're playing with house money because from a personal standpoint, organizational standpoint, what we wanted to do this election cycle is, one, not have Leon Canizero come back as DA. And he had decided not to run. We had our eye on one particular judge who also decided not to run. So when those two sort of goals were met, we were like, everything else is lagniappe. And so I'm like, you know what? I'm jumping in. I'm going to do it. And I told folks, I think Nandi actually laughed out loud when this happened. Graham was incredibly supportive as well, because they knew that I had been a no for all the way up until. And then, we ran a campaign and we ran on our records. That was the other thing. We didn't have to run away from our records. We got to run on the civil rights work, the anti-death penalty work, the juvenile justice reform work. We got to run on all that and make everybody else shuffle and scramble to show how they were going to be more progressive. My opponent started running ads with crying mothers of slain, men, who had been killed at the hands of police. That was her. And in her video ad, she never once mentioned she was a career prosecutor. It changed the debate. So I was really excited at what we were able to do in this campaign as a group. I was really excited and oddly invigorated by the campaign myself. Something I did not expect. After I saw the showing of support and our ability to actually run a credible campaign in this cycle. So there were a lot of lessons learned in this for me in particular, but was really proud at forcing folks to confront real issues and take positions on them in the middle of the campaign. My opponent actually filed a campaign complaint against me, an ethics complaint against me for my mailers. Because in my mailers, I said she had worked her entire life putting poor people in jail, and that she pursued an ill-founded prosecution against a woman who was a DV survivor. So she filed a complaint. And our response was, because they had already shifted to their reform message, part of our response was, look at her website. She concedes that our system is filled with racial and economic bias. She cannot now say it isn't, and that she did not put, and anytime there was a public defender on the other side of the aisle and she asked for somebody to go to jail, she was asking for somebody poor to go to jail. And the Campaign Oversight Committee dismissed her complaint out of hand, saying that they could not say that I was wrong in what I had written in my mailer, which was again a win inside the win for a lot of this. So I'm excited to talk about this and sort of the lessons learned, and thanks for having me on here.
Great, yeah, thanks, Chief. Good to have you on here. Definitely a theme that I want to come back to that you mentioned is really the value of these institutional endorsements and what that means when it's up against a lot of powerful ground game campaigning. So with that, I think that's a good segue to Graham Bosworth, who's joined us on his video. He's now arrived at his home. So on paper, you've got the longest resume of civic involvement, civic leadership out there. You've been involved in the community. You certainly have established yourself here in your civil practice, in addition to work at Tulane and Broad. So what brought you to running for judge in this election cycle?
Well, I mean, I'm kind of unique in this group in two respects. One, as you mentioned, I was a prosecutor. And two, I actually ran for judge previously. I ran in 2014. So to answer the question, I think I really need to talk about a little of that.
Sure.
You know, when I was at the DA's office, I came right out of law school, and it was admittedly a very different DA's office under Eddie Jordan. But at the same time, you recognize almost that it was kind of too easy. The laws were completely stacked in the prosecution's favor, and you're aware of it in the DA's office. And maybe I was more aware of it than most because I was working in the appellate division primarily. And I watched what the office was doing with the multiple bill. I watched what the office was doing with access to diversion at the time, and it was frankly wrong. I was in a position where I could actually kind of comment on it. I could go into Eddie's office and I could go talk with Gaynell, who was the first assistant at the time, and express reservations and concerns with what were going on. And frankly, they would listen to me. That obviously radically changed when Leon came into the office and I left. And then to see it from the DA's office and then see it from the defense perspective, because I started doing public defender work out in Jefferson Parish. Well, I mean, it really hammered home just how bad the inequities in this in the criminal justice system were, and just how horribly the system treats people without the economic means to basically pay for access to the DA's office and to the decision makers at the DA's office. And it made me mad. I mean, I don't know how else to explain it. And so I decided I was going to do something about it. I was going to run for judge because there were two driving factors in the inequities that I saw. One was the statutes, the laws that had been created, and the other were the judges who just didn't really care. The laws made their lives easier. The laws allowed them to force people into pleading. The laws allowed them to get off the bench at 11 o'clock so they could go play golf. And that seemed to be more their focus than actually ensuring that due process was abided by and people were given their chance to be in court. So I planned to run in 2014 for an open seat, which didn't end up being an open seat for a long, weird story that we don't necessarily need to go into. But I promised myself that I would do it again. In 2014, I basically realized that I was not going to win. I wasn't going to make any sort of negative campaigning against my opponent, Marula. I was just going to basically spread my truth, my frustrations with the system. And I actually watched as even Frank Marula was like, oh, okay, yeah, I see what you're saying. And the conversation during the 2014 campaign shifted. We were talking about the multiple bill and how it actually was, unconstitutional and drove inequities. And we were talking about bail bonds and the destructiveness of the bail bond system and how judges were using them to force pleas. And I knew that if I ran again, this conversation would potentially kind of have traction in a way that it didn't really have in 2014. Fast forward to this most recent campaign cycle, and not only has it gained traction, I mean, there's a national discussion about criminal justice reform that are talking about these issues. And I was really excited to run again, frankly, because there was a chance to drive real change. And, obviously a lot of us had talked prior to the campaign about trying to take advantage of this movement to bring this message to New Orleans, because while we here talking, we're like, obviously this is a problem. Obviously people should know about it. The fact of the matter is the vast majority of the city really doesn't understand what goes on at Tulane and Broad. And that we collectively would have a better opportunity of driving this message than we would as an individual candidate here and there. And so, it was a great opportunity to do it. Plus, as Derwyn mentioned, I had real issues with Paul Bonin, and it made it clear pretty early on that I was going to run against him. And Paul chose not to run, and that obviously changed the dynamic. But I had decided that it was still worth running because it was still worth pushing this platform, this discussion, and really bringing the issues that exist in the criminal justice system to the electorate, if for no other reason than to help kind of drive the change that the city needs. And that's why I ended up running.
All right. Thank you for joining us tonight. Hopefully the softball game went well that you're returning from. A couple things that I want to know before we move on to Angel is, there's a lot that people just don't know about the criminal justice system. So what you mentioned, the multiple bill, that is our sentencing enhancement statute in Louisiana. In other places, it feels more like a 3 strikes law, maybe you're familiar with. It basically makes it so that the DAs in so many cases are able to say, you better take this plea deal because if you go to trial and you lose, you will get decades and decades of prison time. So in exchange, take 10, take 5. And really was both the driving force and has been the driving force of just the mass numbers of incarcerated folks coming out of Orleans Parish and going to state prison facilities, as well as the number of people who just had to plead guilty to their cases for fear of the most dire consequences. So a note for our viewers there. A second theme that we'll definitely come back to is you mentioned bail bonds. So we'll have future questions about sort of the power of the bail bonds industry, not just in criminal court races, but city politics at large. But you did talk about a national movement, a change in conversation, and that takes us to Angel Harris, because I think you of us on the panel are probably been most prominent in this national conversation with your time at the NAACP and ACLU, as well as writing for a number of national publications. So coming in from that view, yet you decided to, I think unique on this panel, take on the Goliath of Section L, ranked #1 in efficiency ratings, which is just a desperately inhumane way to think of people who come in and are facing prison time. But you didn't do an open seat. You challenged an incumbent, which is rare. You, spoiler alert, defeated that incumbent, which is exceedingly rare. Hasn't happened actually since the 1970s here. How did you pick your Goliath?
So I'll just say, so I have to stick with my pattern, which is uplifting the voices of Black women. So yesterday was Stacey Abrams' birthday, and Stacey Abrams has a quote where she says, "I think it becomes incredibly important for women who are not expected or any community that is often inherently considered disqualified to declare their intention." And so that is basically my race and like why I decided to do it and why I decided to go against an incumbent, because you often have situations where something is good enough or it's passing, and that was basically what was happening in my opponent's courtroom. When you heard people talk about it, they're like, well, he's not the worst, or he's good enough. And that's bothered me to hear that rhetoric over and over again, because I felt like the people of New Orleans deserve better than good enough. You know, we're talking about people's lives, we're talking about people's livelihoods. And so I couldn't run on a platform about reimagining a system and not challenge an incumbent. Like that to me would have been, you know, against everything that I was talking about. And it wouldn't have felt like a genuine statement for me to say that. Like I can't come into a race saying, let's reimagine, but then I'm allowing someone to sit on the bench that's perpetuating a lot of the things that I want to change. And so that's why I decided to run against an incumbent. And run against a particular incumbent who thought that he was doing the right thing, yet there was a lot of evidence that what he was doing wasn't just. And so that's why. I mean, and also, you know, I'm a little crazy, right? Like I'm like, hey, why not? You know, I guess I felt like if I'm going to do it, I might as well do it big. And I mean, and that's just always how I've tried to, you know, do my career. Like I am going to just go all out, and that's why I did it. And I, you know, I don't want to take up too much more time because I know we're going to get into the specifics of the campaign, but it really was that drive to say enough is enough. And let's really push back on what we are allowing to happen to our communities. And so that's why I decided to run against an incumbent.
Well, we're certainly glad that you did. Our next, so that's introductions for everybody. Our next, really the body of this forum is going to focus on how you ran your campaigns. So various campaign tactics, strategies, where you decided to devote your time, which, you know, how you figured out who you were going to send where, kind of the themes that we've touched on so far. But we will be throwing in audience questions. So Angel has certainly figured out how to interact with the audience question and answer box. If everybody would like to take a moment, at the bottom there should be a Q&A box that when you as a panelist click on it, you should see that there's been one question submitted already by an anonymous attendee. So we will throw those in, but you know, when you're not on the mic, feel free to examine those questions and see if there's something that is of particular interest to you. How I'm going to be doing the rest of the session is, you know, we're going to be hitting on topics, and I kind of have in mind maybe the first person to really speak about these issues that are going to come up. But then after that, you know, we also just don't have time to do this full 5-person circuit around and around again, which also means that I should just stop talking about how we're going to do things and do it. But once Angel tackles this question. Derwyn, if you have something to add that you'd like to add, then go ahead and hop right in. And then Tenee, if you want to follow, same thing. If we've exhausted kind of, so the similarities in your campaigns and we should move on to the next question, I'll read that and then we'll move on to the next topic. So let's experiment with that. Let's get the audience Q&A off the ground. So first, from one of our attendees, Angel has claimed dibs on this. Did you try and target certain voters in your campaign, like Democrats, frequent voters, or certain neighborhoods? It's a big question. Angel, why don't you start us off?
So the first thing I will say, because I know this is a call to sort of help people who are interested in voting and running. The first thing I would say is make sure you have a really good field director. That is the key. And so with the field director, they help you identify, these are the folks that, you should target. These are, the neighborhoods that you can go into. These are where your votes are probably going to come from. So there was a strategy, and that was developed by the field director. But what I will say is, I intentionally, went after Democrats, but then when you think about myself and my opponent are both Democrats, so that doesn't really help you in certain ways. Obviously, you do want people who are voting consistently, but for me, I really wanted to focus on the groups that we don't generally focus on, right? So there were neighborhoods that I went into that a lot of people don't canvass in. And that was intentional on my part. I would go into these neighborhoods, talk with individuals, sit at bus stops and talk with them. And they were surprised that was happening. They would say, no one ever comes over here and talks to us, about the election. And because for me, it was important to make sure that I was helping to empower communities. They have the power to choose who's sitting on the bench. And I wanted people to know that, because I would have conversations and people would say, oh, I didn't even know that you could vote for judges, and so I was very, very intentional about it. I went to car washes. So it's like not even just neighborhoods, but sort of the places where people don't generally canvass. Those were the places that I decided to go, because those were the people that I wanted to make sure I had a conversation with. Those are the people that I knew were, interacting with the criminal court system, because we have to start having people who are being directly impacted by the system have a voice in it. And so I wanted to make sure that they knew that this was coming up on November 3rd. And so, I did the sort of typical selection, but also very intentional about touching the communities that will be coming into, the criminal court system.
And going to those places, picking up those voters, was it you going to these neighborhoods, knocking on doors? Was it surrogates dropping off flyers? How did you get in there?
So it was a combination of both. There were, obviously there were the NOLA defenders. They helped do a lot of canvassing, but also just as I made relationships, that sort of, they then told someone else, right? So, I talked about people that I met at a bus stop. Those women were on their way to work. They worked at Cafe Du Monde. They asked for, push cards from me. So then I had a conversation with them. They then took that on to someone else. And so just establishing those relationships. And I would hear from people who would say, oh, I was at work and there was this woman who was passing out, your information. I was at Costco and they told me, oh, because I also wore my shirt everywhere that I went. Yeah. I had 15 shirts. And so everywhere I went, I had on my shirt. And so I was in Costco and a woman said, there was a woman talking about you in our break room today. And so just really, it was just human interaction and those relationships that I think for me were absolutely key.
And quick shout out to Angel's campaign staff, which does include DSA members.
Yes. Thank you, Chris.
All right, there we go. That's what I was looking for. Anybody else ready to jump in about, where they targeted, what types of voters they targeted, or quite interesting from Angel's commentary, really the sites of interaction, bus stops, like where it is that you decided to campaign. Derwyn, I see you unmuting yourself.
Yeah, I just wanted to chime in a little bit because, you know, Angel's absolutely right. And we're also campaigning inside of a pandemic. So that also made things a little difficult. I felt like, okay, how do I not offend folks, but still get in front of enough people? And so the Zoom game was crazy this campaign. There was a lot of Zoom, and there was a lot of FaceTime on Zoom that we all as candidates had to do. We had to create Zoom. We had a Zoom raiser, a bunch of Zoom fundraisers, a bunch of Zoom meet and greets as ways to get in front of and target folks. And for me, I began by figuring out, okay, I didn't want to take the folks who were supposed to vote for me for granted. So I started by making sure that the support I thought I had, I actually had. And so going through a lot of targeting of sort of friends and allies that I had created over the last 22 years was how we began. And so targeting, it's New Orleans, so everybody's a Democrat, essentially, right? And we're all Democrats as well. So it was, differentiating yourself and making folks know you were in the race and what you stood for. You just had to get in front of enough folks, particularly when you're an 11th hour candidate. Right. There were folks who were like, oh, I didn't know you were running. I'm like, I know. That's what I'm telling you. I'm running right now because it was, you were in a very short timeline and trying to get this done and putting your team together to figure out how to target different folks. Getting good advice was key in terms of who to target, because you did want to target chronic voters. You did want to target Democrats who were more progressive, or people who were more progressive as well. But you also did not, you had to go to places where folks hadn't seen you as well. And I had an event, and there was a young man who showed up at the event, and he was like, I was at the Greater New Orleans Republicans event you were at. I just thought you were the better candidate. And so he showed up at the event as well. And it was the good advice I got with that. So yeah, there was definitely targeting of different folks, both support and folks who maybe hadn't seen you and you assumed were going to be hostile. We had to do a lot of that too. It was a matter of courtesy, particularly for someone who just needed folks to know they were running, that you had to do some of those appearances in front of groups that you knew were never going to support you, but it was a way to let them know who you were as well.
Yeah, and I think we saw some of that from the opposition, where they in particular, I'm thinking of DA candidate Kiva Landrum, who shunned a lot of groups that she anticipated would oppose her, and that some of the analysis I'm hearing, maybe she lost a lot of votes there just because of the signal that sends about a candidate. So I think good points there. Before we move on, okay, so Graham, I saw you unmute, and I wasn't sure if you had something to contribute, but it looks like also Nandi as well. So
I'll let Nandi go. It's okay.
So it was really interesting. We decided early on that I have talked to a lot of jurors. So if you're a criminal defense attorney and you're in trial, I voir dire a lot. So even if the trial doesn't go forward, you get to talk to a lot of people. Early on, we realized that a lot of people might know my face, but not know my name. And so that's how the posters came about. We wanted a poster that people would see the face and eventually could connect to a name. And so, there's a lot of times where almost all of my clients will call me Nandi Campbell, Naomi Campbell, but almost nobody calls me Nandi Campbell. And so, and there are people in court who sees my face and might say, oh, I've seen her in court, or she's vaudeered me, or my student, but I don't know her name. And so it was really important for us in the beginning to kind of try to find a way to connect the face with the name. And so that's how the posters were born. And I think they were instrumental. I think people in New Orleans are really loyal. My clients, from the first day I met, I got a call from the mother of one of my first clients when I was in the public defender's office, when she found out, and she canvassed her neighborhood. I got a call from at least 3 jurors who sat on trials, and they canvassed their neighborhoods. I think that outreach is important for a few reasons. One, you want to get the vote, but second, people have already invested in you and you don't know it until they realize they have an opportunity to show you. And so that was an interesting phenomenon. Another thing is, I am born and raised in New York. I went to law school in Georgia, and then I moved here. And during this campaign, I realized the world is extremely small, right? So I don't even know if Pat is on the line, but I went to law school with Pat's brother, who's friends with me on Facebook, who saw I was running and then reached out to him and said, you have to vote for Nandi. And then Pat's friend, who is that? John Razowitz did a meet and greet, and he's friends with John. And so, trying to find these connects any way possible is really important. The amount of money we spent on Facebook and boosting paid off big time. By the end of the election, people are like, I can't go on Facebook or IG without seeing your face. And it was the cheapest thing, but it was really, really impactful in a way where people were continuously seeing me, right? Last but not least, the public defenders and their organization style was simply amazing. I don't think that I would have been able to touch as many people as I did. I've had people say, oh, I was in the 9th Ward, and these guys were like, oh, I saw my public defenders. They were over here giving out flyers with your name on it. And they were in the community in a way where I know I couldn't have done it with just kind of peers volunteering. And so their organization, their groundwork, their ability to continuously do it, not falling off as we head into election, was really impactful in spreading the word, because I couldn't afford the mailing. So.
All right, thank you for those insights. I know there are probably a lot of public defenders on the line tonight. If you have any questions that you'd like to ask, we're getting some more questions in the chat box as well. Before we move on to the next topic, I want to make sure, Tenee and Graham, if you wanted to add anything, you had the opportunity to.
I was going to make that same comment that Nandi just made about the public defender's office, and to really give them the shout out that they deserve. The outreach of my campaign would have been a fraction of what it was if it hadn't been for the hard work that the public defender's office put in. But I think Nandi said it better than I could.
All right, yeah, ground game. A lot of committed people on your team. Works really, really well. I want to kick off from, I think I'm headed there from Derwyn's comments, as well as Angel's comments on Democrats in the city and kind of institutional politics. So the next subject I want to head to is endorsements, and then we'll get back to the audience questions. So to lead into this, we've got a range of organizations in this city, from big time political machines, Bold in Central City, Action New Orleans with Mayor Cantrell, the Orleans Parish Democratic Executive Committee, OPDEC. Some of you were able to secure these endorsements. Some of you, they absolutely shunned you for reasons that we've kind of already started to talk about. But also we've got other of these alphabet soup organizations, including Meg's campaign was quite good at ferreting out that, for example, LAVA, the Lake Area Voters Association, and Mid-City Democrats were just fronts that were run by Paul Sens's family and represent no constituency whatsoever. So, And then finally, we've got some of these endorsements are merely transactional. It's not actually anybody like signing on to your politics. It's come shake our hands, give us $2,000, $5,000 to cover the expenses of our endorsement, and then we'll put your name on one of our mailers. So really, it's kind of an open question of like, how do you interact with these endorsers? Which ones actually have value? Which ones are toxic? And how do you combat the ones that are just, we purport to represent this constituency that doesn't actually exist? Because a lot of that happened. A lot of co-optation of messaging happened. We saw this in some of our other campaigns. So do I have a first volunteer for this one? Nandi.
I'm going to start because I got a slew of these endorsements, right? So here's the deal. And I pray that this election season, given Angel's raise, given Jason's raise, I hope it's death to the endorsements and the alphabet soup groups. I hope it's just die. And I hope it's the last time. I signed on to it because it was cheaper to give them their pro rata to do the mailing than to do my own mailing, right? It's a total shakedown. It feels sleazy. It serves no purpose. Basically, these organizations are like, we can give you votes. And so individuals in the community don't understand that these people are basically selling their votes. And I live in Central City, and I have a lot of neighbors that go to vote with their ballots. There are a lot of people who rely on these ballots, especially for the down ballot races. And so you see them go to the polls and they have 4 or 5 ballots in their hand, right? I really feel like it should be outlawed in some way. Like, it's just such a racket that you realize at the end of the day, if the pro rata share did not come out less than what it would cost us to hit these places, I would have been terribly disappointed. There were things like, we had the GNO Pat, who never interviewed me, who said, oh, we're gonna endorse you. And I didn't want any kind of Republican endorsement, but we had to think about a way to touch Republicans, and did not do the pro rata share until they guaranteed us that they wouldn't put Trump on the ballot, right? And so it's a racket, and the only way to battle this and kind of allow these organizations to lose steam, because a lot of them had been dormant until this race, right? So there are a few, if you look back, they not participated in some of the other races, but came back, particularly because of the presidential election and because there were so many candidates that they saw an opportunity to make money. It's also a money-making opportunity for these organizations also. And so the only way to combat this is that campaigns, especially when we talk about progressive reform campaigns, we have to decide that we're going to spend this money either together to put ballots out ourselves, or to spend more time getting people out in the streets. And so it's the biggest racket going. I've never seen anything like it until moving here. It's huge, and it's a lot of money involved. Cantrell was the biggest racket this election season with her Action Network. And she was late with it, and she had a bunch of losers, but she made a lot of money. Because we're recording, I'm just gonna leave it there.
All right.
Please go ahead.
Thank you. Are we going to Tenee then?
I thought Angel was gonna go. I can be very brief though, because so I didn't know what I was doing again going into this, right? I didn't know what I was gonna do to reach voters, and then I just started getting emails from different organizations that said, show up for this meeting, and and it was like, it seemed to me like it was like every day. Now, I mean, some of the candidates stopped working in order to run their campaigns, and they were able to really kind of get invested in their campaigns. I, however, never stopped working, right? And so I was in trials, I was going out visiting clients, I was visiting crime scenes. I mean, I was everywhere. And I was raising my son and homeschooling for part of it, right? And so I would spend all day working. I would spend all like early evening with my son, and then I would have to hop onto these Zooms with these groups. And I didn't get all of the endorsements that Nandi was talking about. I didn't pay not a single pro rata share for anything because nobody endorsed me with those groups. I wonder about the value of the groups, you know, just to like kind of parallel it against what Angel was saying earlier about getting out into the communities and meeting people and riding buses, because her opponent took all of those groups, right? They endorsed him before she even got into the race. And she like demolished him, right? And so I have to wonder about the value of actually having those groups support you. I wish I had spent more time doing what Angel did rather than going to all of these meetings, because I think they already know who they're gonna pick going into it. I think it's a racket, like Nandi said, and it's a genuine waste of time. I would have been better served spending that time out in the community, riding a bus and talking to people, I think.
Yeah, so we'll go to Angel next and then Graham, but I think Angel, a lot of people are looking at you as just the gold standard of how to run one of these things. So please enlighten us.
So I can't help but laugh at this question because you're told, there are so many things you're told you're supposed to do, and you like put all this effort into it. Like Tenee said, you know, you have people calling you and saying, come to these endorsement meetings. But the funny thing is, there were groups who never called me. So I didn't have to do half of the ones that everyone else did because they just didn't want to talk to me. So that gave me time to actually go and talk to the community. So thank you for not inviting me to your endorsement meetings. But I actually think it was like a blessing in disguise, because I knew that I had to be out there, putting my name out there, putting my message out there, because I wasn't going to be on the ballot. Right? I knew that what they were going to get in the mail. I also didn't raise nearly even close to as much money as my opponent. So there was no mailer that I was going to be able to send out. And so that's what really made me have to campaign and do it in a very different way. And, you know, I agree with Nandi. I really think that it should, and not even because I wasn't on a lot of those ballots, but I think there should be some rule against it, right? Particularly when we're talking about giving them out like at the poll, or they should have all of the candidates on it, because I think we should have educated voters, right? There can be an organization that says this is who we prefer, but you need to at least let them know who their opponents are. And so that's what really bothered me about that process, was you have people who blindly went into the polls with these ballots. But so the way that I counter that was I was, you know, within the 600 feet that we had to, you know, be in. And I would just walk up to people and say, hi, I'm Angel Harris. I'm running for Section L. And the first thing they would do would look at their ballot. And then the look on their face, because I would talk to them, tell them about my platform. They're like, oh, I like you. Then they'd look at the paper in their hand, realize my name wasn't on there, and then their face would just fall. And there were people who were like, do you have a pen? And they would take a pen, scratch out my opponent's name, and write my name on it. And so I was like, this is what I'm gonna do from now on, like, you know. And so that's what happened. And that's when it dawned on me, like, we aren't educating people on who's completely on the ballot. And so I think if we are going to do that, then we need to make sure that they know who the opponents are. But yeah, I really hope, I hope in the upcoming elections, these groups aren't able to just take money from people, you know, in the future and not really do anything with it. Like, are we really doing the communities a service, you know, by just taking someone's money, and because they wrote a bigger check, they are now being endorsed by a group that claims to be doing something for the betterment of the community. So, yeah.
Yeah, I know in DSA, we focused broadly on public political education to try to, you know, I think our voter guide focuses a lot on what's going on behind the scenes, not just like, here's the name that you should go vote for, because we see all of these mailers. or these sample ballots that go out, and if you're a Democrat, these are the right people to vote for, and it just, from a policy perspective, there's just no running theme.
Can I say something that a lot of people don't know? Cedric Richmond hijacked the official OPDEC ballot because his people did not get the OPDEC nod. He hijacked it, put out his ballot first, and called it the official Democratic ballot, and stalled the official ballot. And then when you got it, it was so small, you would need like a microscope to see on the ballot. That's how ruthless these things are. And because there's research saying people rely on these ballots, they do things like that.
Yeah, I remember seeing that and thinking which affiliation that was. I don't want to keep you waiting much longer, Graham. Sorry to cut in there. Let's head to your endorsement relationship process.
I mean, I guess the question was, what value is there in these ballots? And I think it really depends upon the race. It depends upon the election cycle. In this election cycle, you had 30 separate things that were being voted on by the general population. You had Trump on the ballot, and you knew that there was going to be huge voter turnout with people just voting against Trump, if for no other reason. And in an election like that, there's going to be a huge number of people who just don't know anything about the town ballot races. And they're going to be walking in with these ballots the same way Nandi and everyone else has been talking about. So in those situations, the value of some of the bigger ballots, it is what it is. They are incredibly valuable. You could change the law, but unless you change the law, people are going to be walking in with them. And if they're walking in with them, you need to either be on them, or you need to do kind of what Angel and what the public defenders were doing a phenomenal job of doing, which is offering alternative ballots to the voters who are going in. Those ballots have real value. Now, if you're talking about an off election, if you're talking about the runoff, I don't think ballots mattered anywhere near as much in the runoff that we just had. You had, I think it was 25% voter turnout who came out for that. Was it even 25? I'm not even sure. And you had people who were showing up because they wanted to vote. They knew what they were doing. They wanted their voice to be heard in a particular race. In that instance, the value of ballots is kind of thrown out the window. I think that's the analysis that really needs to come into play. And then when you're looking at which ballots are legit and which aren't, a lot of them are just shyster organizations looking to grab a buck. But the fact of the matter is, some of them really are influential. And if you're not on OPDEC, but you can get on bold, it becomes kind of an equation in terms of how you can get yourself out there and into the ballot box.
Mm-hmm. We certainly saw that this election cycle. I do want to just insert a plug for, I think this is certainly largely on me. DSA does endorse. Our endorsement process, for anyone who's listening out there, is a longer one because it's much more involved. That would mean generally coming to our general meeting, addressing the general membership, and then getting a threshold vote that we are going to endorse you, which doesn't just mean flashy coverage in our voter guide. It means the commitment of material resources. Our hundreds of members are going to be canvassing for you, crisscrossing the city, really putting in our labor in much the same way that what you were talking about, Graham, about the importance of that low turnout runoff election. We had a lot of people who were motivated for proposition number 2 regarding the libraries, because there's so many people in DSA who have strong connections to the library system here. And so a lot of that organizing, I think, ended up in electoral success with that one. So people who are considering campaigns certainly interact with our organization.
Can I say something, Aaron, to that too? How hugely popular the anti-gravity voter guide became, because people want to read why, they want to read about candidates. When you get these ballots, it's just kind of like a check for Nandi Campbell, but it doesn't say anything about who I am or what I stand for. And so I've seen over the last few years how popular that guide has become. because people can digest it. People can take the information and make the decision for themselves. And so like kudos for organizations like Anti-Gravity, Lens, who are throughout the year giving us information to help us come to that conclusion when it's time to vote, which I think is more important than these groups just waking up on election day and saying, here, vote for my cousin.
Yeah, and we certainly hope to be providing
Sorry about that.
service in the future. If I could go back then to audience questions, this one, we're gonna go back to Nandi as she's claimed this one, but certainly we'll circle around to everybody's thoughts. So coming from the audience, do you have ideas now about how you might have prevented opponents from co-opting the reformist message over the course of the campaign? And more optimistically, do you think that just having the campaign on those issues might make some of them better judges? Let's start with Nandi.
So I think it was really interesting. You go to these forums where they claim to be reformists. And so what we have to do is ask the people hosting these forums, they have to ask better questions. Like they would not force people to delve. So like, oh, I'm a reformer. So tell me something about your career. Tell me a time in your career where you had to do, there was no follow-up questions. And so the opponents were able to just get up and say things, and the people hosting these forums were not asking any kind of follow-up. My opponent, like, he's just a hot mess. Nobody asked him any questions about any of that, right? And so when you have a career prosecutor saying, oh, yeah, I'm reformed, no one asks, well, how do you intend to do that? There's no follow-up questions. And so I would like to see forums where we're allowed to ask each other questions, right? Because then you can kind of delve in. I think the fact that we were dealing with COVID and the Zoom, normally we're in a position where we're in this open space and people could do follow-up questions or audience could do questions. So we were kind of limited. But I think in the future, we have to do it in a way where we force these organizations to ask the follow-up questions, even if it means losing time in discussing our platform. But people should understand that this is a farce, right? Because I heard some stuff come out of the mouth and I was just really surprised. And I thought to myself, if he just asks the follow-up question, people are gonna understand that this person doesn't even understand how this works, right? The second part of the question, Jeff, I really hope so. I doubt it. I think that people run for these positions because they think they're prestigious positions. They're about having the robe and the title rather than what they can do for the community. I was hoping that the conversation about reforming the criminal justice system was contagious, because by the time we got to the end of the election, everybody was talking about it. So I was like, oh, this is amazing. We're gonna have like 5 judges go to criminal district court as reformists. But then after the election, and as we start to converge on Tulane and Broad, I know automatically that that is not the case. It's the case that your campaign is being run by people who will do anything. By the way, Rhonda Douglas' campaign was ran by Jay Banks, who is a city council person. Like, we have to understand and say to ourselves, should we allow this system to continue in the manner that it is, right? Is it okay that somebody who works in Jay Banks' office takes a leave of absence to run a campaign, right? And we have to be more transparent about it. But unfortunately, during the election, if you say things like that, then you're looked upon as the boogeyman, right? And so I hope it's the case that they get on the bench and say, oh, you know what? That reformist stuff really sound good. I think I'm going to delve into that. But unfortunately, I just don't think that is true.
Thank you. Graham, we saw you reacting.
I mean, how do you preclude them from co-opting your message? I mean, you can get aggressive and go negative. You can start highlighting their history, and you can start highlighting how the steps that they've actually taken in their careers are in direct contradiction with the message that they're co-opting. But you have to be willing to go negative. Like, I, for one, I'm just not comfortable doing that. I'm not comfortable attacking opponents. I think some of the other people here might disagree with me, but it's just, you know, my integrity means more to me than winning office. So whereas I could have gone negative, I chose not to, and maybe that was a mistake. I don't know. But maybe I'm a little more optimistic than Nandi. I mean, when the entire conversation across the board, when every single candidate is recognizing the importance of, in theory anyway, rethinking the multiple bill, rethinking the use of money bail, it can only, even if it's an incremental inch, it can only improve what's going on in criminal district court. It might not be a radical change, but it'll be better than what it would have been if the conversation hadn't gone in that direction. So from that perspective, I'm proud of what this collective group did. We didn't all win, but I really think we changed the discussion. I think it is going to reflect in what happens over the course of the next 6 years. I'm proud of what the public defender's office did. I think you're going to see that the public defenders are treated better than by a lot of the judges, in large part because of the work that they're doing.
A note on the negative, not necessarily even a question here, but what I saw, and maybe you guys had similar observations, was there was a pattern in a lot of the races where I didn't even see any negative campaign. It was just one of the candidates decided, my opponent went negative, and so I won't stand for it. I saw that in the DA's race. I saw that in a few judicial races. It almost seems like there's the strategic timeline of when I get to campaign on my opponent got negative, so I'm the victim here. Please vote for me. Is that something you saw?
That's why telling the truth is considered negative.
Okay.
So like we tell people, like, research your candidates, get all the information, and if you feel like it's not out there, providing it. I am not sure why it's deemed negative. When I think of negative, I think of like really low blow personal stuff. But if we're talking about people's lives and liberty, we talk about the criminal justice system, pointing out that they're just blowing hot air. I'm not sure how that's a negative thing.
Yeah, and I hope we're able to combat some of that with, I know DSA is planning on doing forums. We weren't able to get that off the ground this time, but certainly I think we'll bring it with the follow-up questions and really dig into the issues. I'm being told, Derwyn, that you have your hand up, which I am not technologically capable of seeing at the moment. So after I ribbed you for having to get your daughters to help you, which you actually need.
Yeah, well, my daughter did not help me, but I did figure it out because I'm too proud to let my daughter help me. That's the thing I need to put out there. But to your point about, quote unquote negative, it's when you say it seems like there's a timeline. Well, generally speaking, the general rule is you go negative when you're behind. And so there's a lot of times you'll see folks going negative later because they've got some piece of data saying that they're behind. And the conventional wisdom is if you're behind, to dig your way back out or get back up, you're going to have to knock your opponent down somehow. So you're going to have to be negative. Now, under the tent, what your team is going to tell you, they're not going to say negative. Your campaign manager isn't going to say negative. They're going to say comparative is what they're going to say. But it really is depending on your personal definition of negative. I think Nandi's is closer to mine. Telling the truth is not negative, in my opinion. It's sometimes there are bad facts on your opponent. And Nandi had a boatload of bad facts on her opponents. So I don't understand why you would sit on those, right? You want to educate the electorate. There are real differences between me and the person I'm running against, and here they are. Without being nasty, without being untruthful, you have an opinion about the work they've done or haven't done, and you want to get that out to folks making a decision about who to vote for. And I think that's something that every candidate, every campaign, every advocacy initiative has to deal with, is the sort of what are the bad facts against you? What are the bad facts against your opponent or the opposition that you're fighting against, and you just sort of have to deal with it. And I think going back earlier to Nandi's response, in that hoping that just the change in the debate would make people better, make these, in our races, the judges who won better. I think Nandi's right. They're not better. They're, we know, for example, that Rhonda gives high bonds. She's got poor people in jail because they're poor. Like she's already started that. We already know she began issuing capiases for folks who didn't show up on Zoom. We know she did that, even though folks were told that court was closed. Right? She's still issuing capiases, and for folks listening, capias is akin to a warrant for folks who aren't showing up on Zoom. So all the talk, all the support of Black Lives Matter, all the support of mitigating or stamping out racial and ethnic LGBTQ BTQ disparities, that she's not practicing it now, and she just got there, right? So it's I think Nandi's closer to the truth. They're going to change their message so that they're going to stick their finger in the wind, see which way the wind is blowing, change their message, get into office, and they're going to be the person they showed you they were before they got into office. But it's our jobs, right, during this time to keep score and hold folks accountable. So we'll see, which is a message that I loved on Nandi's campaign, because she would say in a lot of her speeches, if you don't think and at the end, if you don't think I did the job, I'm going to ask you if I did my job, and if I didn't, you'll make the appropriate vote. So I think she's closer to the truth. Although I'm a hopeful guy generally. Maybe they'll turn around or something, but right now what we're seeing is not so much.
Okay.
Can I just add, sorry, really
Absolutely.
quickly to so sorry, I find a lot of this amusing. Politics is amusing to me. But when we talk about sort of the negative things and those types of things, so I never said anything about my opponent, partially because I just didn't want to utter his name, right? And I wanted to talk about my issues. But I will say, there were other people who did talk about, him and bring to light the issues that were surrounding him. And that was extremely helpful. And I think that it's helpful when it's coming from the community as opposed to coming from the opponent, because they're going to be like, oh, the opponent's going to say anything. But when you have community members who are, really bringing to light what's going on, I think that was, and I didn't plan for that to happen, but I think that was very helpful to me, that there were people having that conversation, but it wasn't me having it. And so that's the only thing that I would add to that.
All right, thank you for that. As we approach our target time of 8:30, I just want to try to sneak in a couple of questions. So this one, before we go back to that last audience question, is a quick one. Tenee, I remember when I was walking around for you, we were using van and minivan apps to kind of track. So I just want to talk about internal team communication, organizing. What were the tools that you were using? And then I guess with special emphasis towards like which ones you thought were effective, which ones you thought maybe you'll skip next time. So if it's all right, Tenee, could I start with you?
Sure. So I have to say, again, I was not prepared to hop into this race and be a candidate. And so I didn't know the first thing about canvassing. And I remember talking to someone and asking them, like, how do I know where to canvass? Like, how do I know where to take stuff to? And this person said to me, don't you have a field director? Don't you have someone who is doing this for you? And I said, no, I don't. I had no clue. And so my campaign chairperson actually took over the cutting of lists for me. And I would just go out with my son. I would go out with my friends, wherever my friends lived. We would go canvass their area. I would go out with my son. I would canvass different areas. And NOLA Defenders did a lot of canvassing for me. I definitely, absolutely, 100%, I think, dropped the ball when it came to getting out and canvassing in neighborhoods. I didn't have a field director. I didn't know what I was doing. I had no clue. My campaign manager was like across the country. It was just a disaster. It was a disaster. And if I didn't have the support of so many people who know who they are, I don't think that I would even have gotten the number of votes that I got. So if I had it to do all over again, I would hire a field manager. I would hire someone who knew what they were doing, who told me where to go and where to be, because I was willing to be wherever I needed to be if someone told me where to be. And I just didn't have that direction in my campaign. So it was hard.
All right, thank you. So let's jump around with that one, expanding from not just tools that you used for organizing and communicating, but also necessary positions, field director, et cetera.
So,
Nandi, yes.
Minivan was amazing because it allowed you to canvass the chronic voters. And so that was amazing. Hustle, we did Hustle, but what I realized is there was so many candidates that people just got tired of receiving so many text messages that I'm not sure if that was as, I don't think it was as effective as it could have been. I really think that people were really pissed off that they were getting from 13, 15 candidates, and you could tell by their responses. Facebook and Instagram is by far the cheapest, most effective tool we had. And targeting, so we got an endorsement from Joe Giarrusso. So we didn't send it to everybody, we sent it to his area using targeted Facebook ads and targeted IG. We get an endorsement from Royce Duplessis, and we would target his neighborhood. And so utilizing that, because it was inexpensive, was really, really a great tool that came in handy. So between that and Minivan, I believe the two. Canvassing field works. At some point I realized that it's great to have a field director. When you hire campaign staff, it's really important to find out how much they have on their plate, right? So that you could factor that in. New Orleans is have a really small population of good campaign people. And so when you have a crowded campaign season like we had, they're stretched thin. And so you wanna have that conversation with them up front so that you know where you stand in their list of clients, right? When I first decided to run, I thought I was going to have a campaign of 6 people, and it ended up being just a campaign of 3 people. And so I had a finance director, a campaign coordinator, and a communications director, and a field director who I started with, but basically just got my list because she was a little overwhelmed with clients. And so I think this notion that you have to have like 6 people, you have to have this person, that person, I think that's dead. I think the most important thing is communication, field, and finance.
Yeah, I would agree with Nandi because I had a very small team. I had campaign manager, field director, and then I had some core volunteer folks. One we've already shouted out, Chris, who helped, and made sure that when I was at events, there were push cards being handed out, or, if I'm talking to a group of people, you have that sort of core volunteer person that's like, Angel's over there, right? So then even if I wasn't able to talk with that particular person, there was somebody who could say, she's right there across the street. Because people like to know that you're out there. That was the reaction that I got every time I was somewhere. If I was out canvassing, they're like, oh, you're the candidate. And I would say yes. And that meant so much to them. And so if you can do that, well, you need to do that as much as possible to show your face, because that one, it shows a level of respect for the voter that you're out there. And so I think, for me, you don't need a large team, but you do need a core group of people that are going to help you, sort of actualize your vision, like what you want to do. And so you're going to have a lot of advice from people about, you should do this, you should do that. It was like a gut check for me. I would hear what people had to say, and then I'm like, not going to do that, right? Because if it didn't go with me personally, and if I knew I was going to be out there and comfortable doing it, then I just decided not to do it. And so I think we are past the time of doing things the way that they've been done. And I think once we realize that, like, we could have some really amazing people in office, like, it's really time to push back against this is the sort of checklist of what you need.
Speaking of past the time, we are past the time of 8:30. I would like to ask 2 more questions, if it's not tremendously disrespectful of your time and our audience's time. The first could probably be answered by one person. It's the audience question that we have sitting in the box. Was there conversation among all y'all as insurgent, progressive, flip the bench candidates to campaign as more of a slate, specifically of combining ground game tactics, sharing campaign resources, etc.? Is there anybody who's able to take that on?
Legally, because of the canons running for judge, we were not able to coordinate with each other because that would be seen as an endorsement. And I think that's why there was the slate, the public defenders, the flip the bench slate, PACs, so that's the purpose they serve. I think there was some conversation prior to qualifying. Qualify because of the judicial canons, you have to be careful about what would be perceived as an endorsement of another campaign.
Okay, so then I guess going to Derwyn and Graham, let me rephrase that question a bit. What do you think the effectiveness was of campaigning as a progressive slate, of having all your names affiliated not just with each other, but with an idea?
Well, go ahead, Graham.
You want me to go first?
I'm sorry.
I mean, I think it comes with pros and cons. I mean, the pro is, and I think I mentioned this before, I really think that it did help push the kind of messaging, the notion that things aren't really going well for the city of criminal district courts in a way that individual candidates couldn't necessarily do. The reach in the city, I think, was further. But at the same time, I think it also put a target on our collective backs. You saw our message being co-opted. And you saw, I mean, I said this a lot during the campaign. I think what the slate really represented was, to a large degree, an existential threat to the powers that be in the city of New Orleans. When you run for office, typically, you pay your way into the game. You pay into an organization. You work your way up through the ranks. When they finally say it's your time to run, you know, they give you their blessing. You pay them a bunch of money. Then it's your job to pay their consultants, their media people, and they've really commoditized the process of running for judge or any, frankly, office. And what you had were a bunch of candidates who hadn't done any of that, who were running as complete independents, and who, by even indirectly operating as a collective in this slate, because Nandi's absolutely right, once this started, we weren't able to collaborate, really had a voice that I think really concerned the powers that be. And then we became a target in a lot of ways. So you had both a pro and con associated with it. But I mean, again, I said this before, and I may be the naive optimist here. I still think it was worthwhile because I really do think it pushed the conversation in a way that can only benefit, you know, our message and what we were trying to achieve at criminal court.
All right, thank you for that, Derwyn. Not to cut you off, but I think you'll actually be a good start for my final question. Less about campaigning, more about the fact that we have an audience today of people who are very much involved in city politics and want to continue to be involved in city politics. My fear is that we are perhaps coming into some dark times ahead, that the conditions that we have of economic downturn, attempted austerity in budgeting from the city, growing inequality. These are often the conditions that lead to increase in crime statistics, where we are aware that crime statistics are a function of whatever the government decides is criminal and where they decide to do the policing. But we may see reported in the media increases in crime, worsening of conditions, the need to come down hard, reversing as what tends to happen, the pendulum of society's appetite for criminal justice reform. Just as a prediction, that is something that I think we may be looking at. How do we, in light of the messaging on reform that we've been able to achieve the last bunch of years, the progress of this campaign, how do we combat that reversal of the pendulum perhaps in these months and years to come?
That's a really tough question. You saved for last for me. But let me take a stab at it. I think because many of us on this event have been through these cycles before. Certainly I have seen things go up and down. And I think part of the answer is looking with distance in our eyes and with hindsight at this cycle of elections and what was created, what was built through these elections, because I think what some NOLA Defenders for Equal Justice, Flip the Bench, these features of our political landscape are brand new and have changed the game in, I think, positive ways. And we need to maintain these structures. The thing about entrenched power or sort of traditional power is they depend on things not changing. They depend on a predictable landscape. And so when we came along as sort of insurgent candidates, credible insurgent candidates, not just folks who made sort of paper campaigns, but had real campaigns, they have to pay attention. And paying attention means paying attention to the issues we raised. So the folks who were engaged in these campaigns, the folks who supported us and others like us, need to remain engaged and active and continue to be willing to walk the streets and canvass and raise money and do those things for the candidates that represent these interests, because that will be the wall, that will be the bulwark that is created against what you're talking about. Because folks in power recognize constituency. If you don't have constituency, then decisions will be made with you as an acceptable sort of loss, or you'll simply be ignored. What we showed through our campaigns is that we actually have folks who are paying attention, who care about these issues, and are willing to make folks, put folks in positions of power and take people in positions of power out. You know, the scariest thing for our bench, quite honestly, is that Angel's about to be a judge, right? They are, I can tell you from personal observation, they are terrified at what that means. The idea that Nandi can run on a platform of equity and change and still have and work hard to gain support and trust is a game changer. And so it's going to be folks not falling asleep, not letting this infrastructure turn to dust, that is going to keep our communities safe from that kind of nonsense that we saw in like the late 70s and 80s with the wars on crimes, the proliferation of habitual offender laws, gang enhancements. All that stuff happened because we thought there was nothing we could do. If this election tells us anything, there's absolutely something we can do to make sure that doesn't happen.
Thank you very much for letting me put you on the spot and for those closing remarks. Nandi, I see you're unmuted as well.
I just want to add to that, and I challenge everybody on here. It's like, what if we kind of like burst our own progressive bubble and start converting these people who were intrigued by this message, this new message, right? To me, that is the answer, right? If we have piqued the interest of some people, if the people who worked at Cafe Du Monde, Angel, started this conversation that they might not, I believe that part of the problem with progressive Democrats is that we tend to just sit around and talk to each other, right? And so there's no growth if we're all just sitting in the same pool, just keep talking. And so if we take this momentum and say, we're going to now have these in-depth conversations, not wait till election time to do it, right? But continuously talking about this to different people, different groups, right? The youth. I remember sitting down having a conversation with Frida about why this was important. And it was really enlightening for her, right? Using her cousin's case to explain to her why this is important. So that's part of the mission, not to wait to election, to have to be the cool kids on the block or the people on the outside looking in, but continuously chipping away. So when election time comes, that we already have our bases growing little by little by little. And I think that is important. And I think that's what the slate brought to New Orleans, the conversation, right? We didn't have 7 people elected, but there was conversation about why a slate was needed. And although people didn't commit to electing all of us, what they did say was that there's a conversation to be had. And so we have to keep that work up. And we also have to defend people who are doing the hard work, right? And so if you're doing the hard work and you're making the hard calls and you're doing it in a way where the newspaper are battering you and hitting you hard and every day they're just jamming you. I used to tell people that when I'm when I was canvassing, I used to say, just remember to have my back when I'm trying to do this work, right? Remember to speak up for me when the papers are hammering me for doing the right thing. And so for me, in order to deal with these hard times that's coming, we have to continuously be willing to have the conversations, not just with ourselves, but with people who are interested in having the conversations, but don't necessarily know how to start it or who to start it with.
Angel, yes.
Just to add briefly, so also when we start talking about, the articles that are going to come out about crime, skyrocketing and all that, really pushing back on those narratives and asking, the hard questions. Like if there's an article that comes out, what statistics are you looking at? What data points are you looking at? And so like this level of transparency in the entire system, because part of what's happening, and this was part of my work with the Justice Collaborative, right, is about like those narratives in the media and how do we push back on those narratives. And that's what we have to do as a community. We have to have the conversation, that Nandi was just talking about. We have to continue to have these conversations and putting it into the right perspective. Like, yes, we can talk about this rise, in crime, or this rise in crime, but are we really looking at the full picture? What are we looking at? Are we just looking at a small, slither? And so that for me is going to be the important thing for the community to do, is to, yes, hold us accountable, absolutely, in our actions, but also who's reporting these things, hold them accountable. Like we have the power to make sure that we are getting judges who are fair and just, but also reporters who are reporting accurate facts. And so I think that's what we need to start looking into as well.
Right. Thank you for those thoughts. Thank you everybody for your time and your grace this evening. My apologies to all of the softball players, chess champions, soccer players who have been missing their parents and wondering why they have been sitting in front of the computer for the last nearly 2 hours. Thanks also go out to our team here at the New Orleans chapter of the Democratic Socialists of America, including Jeff, who was on tech tonight, Ty, who is in charge of graphics, Noah and Kate, who are in charge of logistics. Thank you to you all, and thank you to our audience. For further information, visit us at dsaneworleans.org to learn about our work in the city and keep up with these candidates and judges, as I'm sure we will see more from them in the future. Thank you all for your time tonight, and for letting me freshen up my direct examination skills with you on this stand. Good night.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone, for your time. That was so wonderful. And I'm so also glad that we got a video of it, because I just know that this will do so much for people's future organizing in the city. And I just can't thank you enough for your time.
Thank you, everybody. Have a
Thank
good
you so
night.
much.
Good night.
All right, cool.